This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Today's reading by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 3. 'Twas when the fields were swept of autumn's store, and growing winds the fading foliage tore, behind the Lowman hill the short-lived light, descending slowly, ushered in the night. When from the noisy town with mournful look his lonely way the meagre peddler took. Wilson. A storm below the highlands of the Hudson, if it be introduced with an easterly wind, seldom lasts less than 2 days. Accordingly, as the inmates of the Locusts assembled on the following morning around their early breakfast, the driving rain was seen to strike in nearly horizontal lines against the windows of the building, and forbade the idea of exposing either man or beast to the tempest. Harper was the last to appear. After taking a view of the state of the weather, he apologized to Mr. Wharton for the necessity that existed for his trespassing on his goodness for a longer time. To appearances the reply was as courteous as the excuse, yet Harper wore a resignation in his deportment that was widely different from the uneasy manner of the father. Henry Wharton had resumed his disguise with a reluctance amounting to disgust, but in obedience to the commands of his parent. No communications passed between him and the stranger, after the first salutations of the morning had been paid by Harper to him in common with the rest of the family. Frances had, indeed, thought there was something like a smile passing over the features of the traveller, when, on entering the room, he first confronted her brother, but it was confined to the eyes, seeming to want power to affect the muscles of the face, and was soon lost in the settled and benevolent expression which reigned in his countenance, with a sway but seldom interrupted. The eyes of the affectionate sister were turned in anxiety for a moment on her brother, and glancing again on their unknown quest, met his look, as he offered her with marked attention one of the little civilities of the table, and the heart of the girl, which had begun to throb with violence, regained a pulsation as tempered as youth, health, and buoyant spirits could allow. While yet seated at the table, Caesar entered, and laying a small parcel in silence by the side of his master, modestly retired behind his chair, where, placing one hand on its back, he continued, in an attitude half familiar, half respectful, a listener. "What is this, Caesar?" inquired Mr. Wharton, turning the bundle over to examine its envelope, and eyeing it rather suspiciously. "The baccy, sir. Harvey Birch he got home, and he bring you a little good baccy from York." "Harvey Birch!" rejoined the master with great deliberation, stealing a look at his guest. "I do not remember desiring him to purchase any tobacco for me, but as he has brought it, he must be paid for his trouble." For an instant only, as the negro spoke, did Harper suspend his silent meal. His eye moved slowly from the servant to the master, and again all remained in impenetrable reserve. To Sarah Wharton this intelligence gave unexpected pleasure. Rising from her seat with impatience, she bade the black show Birch into the apartment, when, suddenly recollecting herself, she turned to the traveller with an apologizing look, and added, "If Mr. Harper will excuse the presence of a peddler." The indulgent benevolence expressed in the countenance of the stranger, as he bowed a silent acquiescence, spoke more eloquently than the nicest framed period, and the young lady repeated her order with a confidence in its truth that removed all embarrassment. In the deep recesses of the windows of the cottage were seats of panelled work, and the rich damask curtains that had ornamented the parlour in Queen Street. The Americans changed the names of many towns and streets at the Revolution, as has since been done in France. Thus, in the city of New York, Crown Street has become Liberty Street, King Street, Pine Street, and Queen Street, then one of the most fashionable quarters of the town, Pearl Street. Pearl Street is now chiefly occupied by the auction dealers and the wholesale dry goods merchants, for warehouses and counting rooms. Had been transferred to the Locusts, and gave to the room that indescribable air of comfort which so gratefully announces the approach of a domestic winter. Into one of these recesses Captain Wharton now threw himself, drawing the curtain before him in such a manner as to conceal most of his person from observation, while his younger sister, losing her natural frankness of manner in an air of artificial constraint, silently took possession of the other. Harvey Birch had been a peddler from his youth, at least so he frequently asserted, and his skill in the occupation went far to prove the truth of the declaration. He was a native of one of the eastern colonies, and, from something of superior intelligence which belonged to his father, it was thought they had known better fortune in the land of their nativity. Harvey possessed, however, the common manners of the country, and was in no way distinguished from men of his class but by his acuteness, and the mystery which enveloped his movements. 10 years before they had arrived together in the Vale, and purchasing the humble dwelling at which Harper had made his unsuccessful application, continued ever since peaceful inhabitants, but little noticed and but little known. Until age and infirmities had prevented, the father devoted himself to the cultivation of the small spot of ground belonging to his purchase, while the son pursued with avidity his humble barter. Their orderly quietude had soon given them so much consideration in the neighbourhood as to induce a maiden of 35 to forget the punctilio of her sex, and to accept the office of presiding over their domestic comforts. The roses had long before vanished from the cheeks of Katy Haynes, and she had seen in succession both her male and female acquaintances forming the union so desirable to her sex, with but little or no hope left for herself, when, with views of her own, she entered the family of the Birches. Necessity is a hard master, and, for the want of a better companion, the father and son were induced to accept her services. But still Katy was not wanting in some qualities which made her a very tolerable housekeeper. On the one hand, she was neat, industrious, honest, and a good manager. On the other, she was talkative, selfish, superstitious, and inquisitive. By dint of using the latter quality with consummate industry, she had not lived in the family 5 years when she triumphantly declared that she had heard, or rather overheard, sufficient to enable her to say what had been the former fate of her associates. Could Katy have possessed enough of divination to pronounce upon their future lot, her task would have been accomplished. From the private conversations of the parent and child, she learned that a fire had reduced them from competence to poverty, and at the same time diminished the number of their family to 2. There was a tremulousness in the voice of the father, as he touched lightly on the event, which affected even the heart of Katy, but no barrier is sufficient to repel vulgar curiosity. She persevered, until a very direct intimation from Harvey, by threatening to supply her place with a female a few years younger than herself, gave her awful warning that there were bounds beyond which she was not to pass. From that period the curiosity of the housekeeper had been held in such salutary restraint that, although no opportunity of listening was ever neglected, she had been able to add but little to her stock of knowledge. There was, however, one piece of intelligence, and that of no little interest to herself, which she had succeeded in obtaining, and from the moment of its acquisition she directed her energies to the accomplishment of one object, aided by the double stimulus of love and avarice. Harvey was in the frequent habit of paying mysterious visits in the depth of the night to the fireplace of the apartment that served for both kitchen and parlour. Here he was observed by Katy, and availing herself of his absence and the occupations of the father, by removing one of the hearthstones, she discovered an iron pot, glittering with a metal that seldom fails to soften the hardest heart. Katy succeeded in replacing the stone without discovery, and never dared to trust herself with another visit. From that moment, however, the heart of the Virgin lost its obduracy, and nothing interposed between Harvey and his happiness but his own want of observation. The war did not interfere with the traffic of the peddler, who seized on the golden opportunity which the interruption of the regular trade afforded, and appeared absorbed in the one grand object of amassing money. For a year or two his employment was uninterrupted, and his success proportionate; but at length dark and threatening hints began to throw suspicion around his movements, and the civil authority thought it incumbent on them to examine narrowly into his mode of life. His imprisonments, though frequent, were not long, and his escapes from the guardians of the law easy, compared to what he endured from the persecution of the military. Still Birch survived, and still he continued his trade, though compelled to be very guarded in his movements, especially whenever he approached the northern boundaries of the county, or, in other words, the neighbourhood of the American lines. His visits to the Locusts had become less frequent, and his appearance at his own abode so seldom as to draw forth from the disappointed Katy, in the fullness of her heart, the complaint we have related in her reply to Harper. Nothing, however, seemed to interfere with the pursuits of this indefatigable trader, who, with a view to dispose of certain articles for which he could only find purchasers in the very wealthiest families of the county, had now braved the fury of the tempest, and ventured to cross the half-mile between his own residence and the house of Mr. Wharton. In a few minutes after receiving the commands of his young mistress, Caesar reappeared, ushering into the apartment the subject of the foregoing digression. In person the peddler was a man above the middle height, spare, but full of bone and muscle. At first sight his strength seemed unequal to manage the unwieldy burden of his pack, yet he threw it on and off with great dexterity, and with as much apparent ease as if it had been filled with feathers. His eyes were grey, sunken, restless, and for the flitting moments that they dwelt on the countenance of those with whom he conversed, they seemed to read the very soul. They possessed, however, two distinct expressions, which, in a great measure, characterized the whole man. When engaged in traffic, the intelligence of his face appeared lively, active, and flexible, though uncommonly acute. If the conversation turned on the ordinary transactions of life, his air became abstracted and restless; but if by chance the Revolution and the country were the topic, his whole system seemed altered. All his faculties were concentrated. He would listen for a great length of time without speaking, and then would break silence by some light and jocular remark that was too much at variance with his former manner not to be affectation. But of the war and of his father he seldom spoke, and always from some very obvious necessity. To a superficial observer, avarice would seem his ruling passion, and, all things considered, he was as unfit a subject for the plans of Katy Haynes as can be readily imagined. On entering the room, the peddler relieved himself from his burden, which, as it stood on the floor, reached nearly to his shoulders, and saluted the family with modest civility. To Harper he made a silent bow, without lifting his eyes from the carpet, but the curtain prevented any notice of the presence of Captain Wharton. Sarah gave but little time for the usual salutations before she commenced her survey of the contents of the pack, and, for several minutes, the two were engaged in bringing to light the various articles it contained. The tables, chairs, and floor were soon covered with silks, crepes, gloves, muslins, and all the stock of an itinerant trader. Caesar was employed to hold open the mouth of the pack, as its hoards were discharged, and occasionally he aided his young lady by directing her admiration to some article of finery, which, from its deeper contrast in colours, he thought more worthy of her notice. At length, Sarah, having selected several articles, and satisfactorily arranged the prices, observed in a cheerful voice, "But, Harvey, you have told us no news. Has Lord Cornwallis beaten the rebels again?" The question could not have been heard, for the peddler, burying his body in the pack, brought forth a quantity of lace of exquisite fineness, and, holding it up to view, he required the admiration of the young lady. Miss Peyton dropped the cup she was engaged in washing from her hand, and Frances exhibited the whole of that lovely face, which had hitherto only suffered one of its joyous eyes to be seen, beaming with a colour that shamed the damask which enviously concealed her figure. The aunt quitted her employment, and Birch soon disposed of a large portion of his valuable article. The praises of the ladies had drawn the whole person of the younger sister into view, and Frances was slowly rising from the window, as Sarah repeated her question, with an exultation in her voice, that proceeded more from pleasure in her purchase than her political feelings. The younger sister resumed her seat, apparently examining the state of the clouds, while the peddler, finding a reply was expected, answered, "There is some talk below about Tarleton having defeated General Sumter on the Tiger River." Captain Wharton now involuntarily thrust his head between the opening of the curtains into the room, and Frances, turning her ear in breathless silence, noticed the quiet eyes of Harper looking at the peddler, over the book he was affecting to read, with an expression that denoted him to be a listener of no ordinary interest. "Indeed!" cried the exulting Sarah. "Sumter, Sumter, who is he? I'll not buy even a pin until you tell me all the news," she continued, laughing and throwing down a muslin she had been examining. For a moment the peddler hesitated. His eye glanced towards Harper, who was yet gazing at him with settled meaning, and the whole manner of Birch was altered. Approaching the fire, he took from his mouth a large allowance of the Virginian weed, and depositing it, with the superabundance of its juices, without mercy to Miss Peyton's shining andirons, he returned to his goods. "He lives somewhere among the niggers to the south," answered the peddler, abruptly. "No more nigger than be yourself, Mr. Birch," interrupted Caesar, tartly, dropping at the same time the covering of the goods in high displeasure. "Hush, Caesar, hush, never mind it now," said Sarah Wharton soothingly, impatient to hear further. "A black man so good as white, Miss Sally," continued the offended negro, "so long as he behave hisself." "And frequently he is much better," rejoined his mistress. "But, Harvey, who is this Mr. Sumter?" A slight indication of humor showed itself on the face of the peddler, but it disappeared, and he continued as if the discourse had met with no interruption from the sensitiveness of the domestic. "As I was saying, he lives among the colored people in the South." Caesar resumed his occupation. "And he has lately had a scrimmage with this Colonel Tarleton." "Who defeated him, of course," cried Sarah with confidence. "So say the troops at Morrisania." "But what do you say?" Mr. Wharton ventured to inquire, yet speaking in a low tone. "I repeat but what I hear," said Birch, offering a piece of cloth to the inspection of Sarah, who rejected it in silence, evidently determined to hear more before she made another purchase. "They say, however, at the Plains," the peddler continued, first throwing his eyes again around the room, and letting them rest for an instant on Harper, "that Sumter and one or two more were all that were hurt, and that the rig'lars were all cut to pieces, for the militia were fixed snugly in a log barn." "Not very probable," said Sarah, contemptuously, "though I make no doubt the rebels got behind the logs." "I think," said the peddler, coolly, again offering the silk. "It's quite ingenious to get a log between one and a gun, instead of getting between a gun and a log." The eyes of Harper dropped quietly on the pages of the volume in his hand, while Frances, rising, came forward with a smile in her face, as she inquired, in a tone of affability that the peddler had never witnessed from her, "Have you more of the lace, Mr. Birch?" The desired article was immediately produced, and Frances became a purchaser also. By her order, a glass of liquor was offered to the trader, who took it with thanks, and having paid his compliments to the master of the house and the ladies, drank the beverage. "So it is thought that Colonel Tarleton has worsted General Sumter?" said Mr. Wharton, affecting to be employed in mending the cup that was broken by the eagerness of his sister-in-law. "I believe they think so at Morrisania," said Birch dryly. "Have you any other news, friend?" asked Captain Wharton, venturing to thrust his face without the curtains. "Have you heard that Major André has been hanged?" Captain Wharton started, and for a moment glances of great significance were exchanged between him and the trader, when he observed, with affected indifference, "That must have been some weeks ago." "Does his execution make much noise?" asked the father, striving to make the broken china unite. "People will talk, you know, squire." "Is there any probability of movements below, my friend, that will make travelling dangerous?" asked Harper, looking steadily at the other in expectation of his reply. Some bunches of ribbons fell from the hands of Birch. His countenance changed instantly, losing its keen expression in intent meaning, as he answered slowly, "It is some time since the regular cavalry were out, and I saw some of De Lancey's men cleaning their arms, as I passed their quarters. It would be no wonder if they took the scent soon, for the Virginia horse are low in the county." "Are they in much force?" asked Mr. Wharton, suspending all employment in anxiety. "I did not count them." Francis was the only observer of the change in the manner of Birch, and on turning to Harper he had resumed his book in silence. She took some of the ribbons in her hand, laid them down again, and bending over the goods so that her hair, falling in rich curls, shaded her face, she observed, blushing with a color that suffused her neck, "I thought the Southern horse had marched towards the Delaware." "It may be so," said Birch. "I passed the troops at a distance." Caesar had now selected a piece of calico, in which the gaudy colors of yellow and red were contrasted on a white ground, and after admiring it for several minutes, he laid it down with a sigh, as he exclaimed, "Very pretty calico." "That," said Sarah, "yes, that would make a proper gown for your wife, Caesar." "Yes, Miss Sally," cried the delighted black. "It make old Dinah heart leap for joy, so berry genteel." "Yes," added the peddler quaintly, "that is only wanting to make Dinah look like a rainbow." Caesar eyed his young mistress eagerly, until she inquired of Harvey the price of the article. "Why, much as I light of chaps," said the peddler. "How much?" demanded Sarah in surprise. "According to my luck in finding purchasers. For my friend Dinah, you may have it at 4 shillings. "It is too much," said Sarah, turning to some goods for herself. "Monstrous price for coarse calico, Mr. Birch," grumbled Caesar, dropping the opening of the pack again. "We will say 3, then," added the peddler, "if you like that better." "Be sure he like 'em better," said Caesar, smiling good-humoredly and reopening the pack. "Miss Sally like a 3 shilling when she give, and a 4 shilling when she take." The bargain was immediately concluded, but in measuring the cloth wanted a little of the well-known 10 yards required by the dimensions of Dinah. By dint of a strong arm, however, it grew to the desired length, under the experienced eye of the peddler, who conscientiously added a ribbon of corresponding brilliancy with the calico, and Caesar hastily withdrew, to communicate the joyful intelligence to his aged partner. During the movements created by the conclusion of the purchase, Captain Wharton had ventured to draw aside the curtain, so as to admit a view of his person, and he now inquired of the peddler, who had begun to collect the scattered goods, at what time he had left the city. "At early twilight," was the answer. "So lately!" cried the other in surprise; then, correcting his manner, by assuming a more guarded air, he continued, "Could you pass the pickets at so late an hour?" "I did," was the laconic reply. "You must be well known by this time, Harvey, to the officers of the British army," cried Sarah, smiling knowingly on the peddler. "I know some of them by sight," said Birch, glancing his eyes round the apartment, taking in their course Captain Wharton, and resting for an instant on the countenance of Harper. Mr. Wharton had listened intently to each speaker, in succession, and had so far lost the affectation of indifference as to be crushing in his hand the pieces of china on which he had expended so much labor in endeavoring to mend it, when, observing the peddler tying the last knot in his pack, he asked abruptly, "Are we about to be disturbed again with the enemy?" "Who do you call the enemy?" said the peddler, raising himself erect, and giving the other a look, before which the eyes of Mr. Wharton sank in instant confusion. "All our enemies who disturb our peace," said Miss Peyton, observing that her brother was unable to speak. "But are the royal troops out from below?" "'Tis quite likely they soon may be," returned Birch, raising his pack from the floor, and preparing to leave the room. "And the Continentals," continued Miss Peyton mildly, "are the Continentals in the county?" Harvey was about to utter something in reply, when the door opened, and Caesar made his appearance, attended by his delighted spouse. The race of blacks of which Caesar was a favorable specimen is becoming very rare. The old family servant who, born and reared in the dwelling of his master, identified himself with the welfare of those whom it was his lot to serve, is giving place in every direction to that vagrant class which has sprung up within the last 30 years, and whose members roam through the country unfettered by principles and uninfluenced by attachments. For it is one of the curses of slavery that its victims become incompetent to the attributes of a freeman. The short curly hair of Caesar had acquired from age a coloring of gray that added greatly to the venerable cast of his appearance. Long and indefatigable applications of the comb had straightened the close curls of his forehead, until they stood erect in a stiff and formal brush, that gave at least 2 inches to his stature. The shining black of his youth had lost its glistening hue, and it had been succeeded by a dingy brown. His eyes, which stood at a most formidable distance from each other, were small, and characterized by an expression of good feeling, occasionally interrupted by the petulance of an indulged servant. They, however, now danced with inward delight. His nose possessed, in an eminent manner, all the requisites for smelling, but with the most modest unobtrusiveness, the nostrils being abundantly capacious, without thrusting themselves in the way of their neighbors. His mouth was capacious to a fault, and was only tolerated on account of the double row of pearls it contained. In person Caesar was short, and we should say square, had not all the angles and curves of his figure bid defiance to anything like mathematical symmetry. His arms were long and muscular, and terminated by 2 bony hands, that exhibited on one side a coloring of blackish gray, and on the other a faded pink. But it was in his legs that nature had indulged her most capricious humor. There was an abundance of material injudiciously used. The calves were neither before nor behind, but rather on the outer side of the limb, inclining forward, and so close to the knee as to render the free use of that joint a subject of doubt. In the foot, considering it as a base on which the body was to rest, Caesar had no cause of complaint. unless, indeed, it might be that the leg was placed so near the centre as to make it sometimes a matter of dispute whether he was not walking backwards. But whatever might be the faults a statuary could discover in his person, the heart of Caesar Thompson was in the right place, and, we doubt not, of very just dimensions. Accompanied by his ancient companion, Caesar now advanced, and paid his tribute of gratitude in words. Sarah received them with great complacency, and made a few compliments to the taste of the husband and the probable appearance of the wife. Frances, with a face beaming with a look of pleasure that corresponded to the smiling countenances of the blacks, offered the service of her needle in fitting the admired calico to its future uses. The offer was humbly and gratefully accepted. As Caesar followed his wife and the peddler from the apartment, and was in the act of closing the door, he indulged himself in a grateful soliloquy by saying aloud, "Good little lady, Miss Fanny. Take care of her fader. Love to make a gown for old Dinah, too." What else his feelings might have induced him to utter is unknown, but the sound of his voice was heard some time after the distance rendered his words indistinct. Harper had dropped his book, and he sat an admiring witness of the scene, and Frances enjoyed a double satisfaction, as she received an approving smile from a face which concealed, under the traces of deep thought and engrossing care, the benevolent expression which characterizes all the best feelings of the human heart. End of Chapter 3. Recorded on November 5th, 2005, in Oceanside, California. Is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Today's reading by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper, Chapter 4. It is the form, the eye, the word, the bearing of that stranger lord. His stature manly, bold, and tall, built like a castle's battled wall, yet moulded in such just degrees his giant strength seems lightsome ease. Weather and war their rougher trace have left on that majestic face, but 'tis his dignity of eye. There, if a suppliant, would I fly secure mid danger, wrongs, and grief, of sympathy, redress, relief. That glance, if guilty, would I dread more than the doom that spoke me dead. "Enough, enough!" the princess cried. "'Tis Scotland's hope, her joy, her pride." Walter Scott. The party sat in silence for many minutes after the peddler had withdrawn. Mr. Wharton had heard enough to increase his uneasiness, without in the least removing his apprehensions on behalf of his son. The captain was impatiently wishing Harper in any other place than the one he occupied with such apparent composure, while Miss Peyton completed the disposal of her breakfast equipage with the mild complacency of her nature, aided a little by an inward satisfaction at possessing so large a portion of the trader's lace. Sarah was busily occupied in arranging her purchases, and Frances was kindly assisting in the occupation, disregarding her own neglected bargains, when the stranger suddenly broke the silence by saying, "If any apprehensions of me induce Captain Wharton to maintain his disguise, I wish him to be undeceived. Had I motives for betraying him, they could not operate under present circumstances." The younger sister sank into her seat, colorless and astonished. Miss Peyton dropped the tea-tray she was lifting from the table, and Sarah sat with her purchases unheeded in her lap, in speechless surprise. Mr. Wharton was stupefied, but the captain, hesitating a moment from astonishment, sprang into the middle of the room, and exclaimed, as he tore off the instruments of his disguise, "I believe you from my soul, and this tiresome imposition shall continue no longer. Yet I am at a loss to conceive in what manner you should know me." "You really look so much better in your proper person, Captain Wharton," said Harper with a slight smile. "I would advise you never to conceal it in future. There is enough to betray you, if other sources of detection were wanting." As he spoke, he pointed to a picture suspended over the mantelpiece, which exhibited the British officer in his regimentals. "I had flattered myself," cried young Wharton with a laugh, "that I looked better on the canvas than in a masquerade. You must be a close observer, sir." "Necessity has made me one," said Harper, rising from his seat. Frances met him as he was about to withdraw, and, taking his hand between both her own, said with earnestness, her cheeks mantling with their richest vermilion, "You cannot, you will not betray my brother." For an instant Harper paused in silent admiration of the lovely pleader, and then, folding her hands on his breast, he replied solemnly, "I cannot, and I will not." He released her hands, and laying his own on her head gently, continued, "If the blessing of a stranger can profit you, receive it." He turned, and, bowing low, retired, with a delicacy that was duly appreciated by those he quitted, to his own apartment. The whole party were deeply impressed with the ingenuous and solemn manner of the traveller, and all but the father found immediate relief in his declaration. Some of the cast-off clothes of the captain, which had been removed with the goods from the city, were produced, and young Wharton, released from the uneasiness of his disguise, began at last to enjoy a visit which had been undertaken at so much personal risk to himself. Mr. Wharton retiring to his apartment in pursuance of his regular engagements, the ladies with the young man were left to an uninterrupted communication on such subjects as were most agreeable. Even Miss Peyton was affected with the spirits of her young relatives, and they sat for an hour enjoying, in heedless confidence, the pleasures of an unrestrained conversation, without reflecting on any danger which might be impending over them. The city and their acquaintances were not long neglected, for Miss Peyton, who had never forgotten the many agreeable hours of her residence within its boundaries, soon inquired, among others, after their old acquaintance, Colonel Wellmere. "Oh," cried the captain gaily, "he yet continues there, as handsome and as gallant as ever." Although a woman be not actually in love, she seldom hears without a blush the name of a man whom she might love, and who has been connected with herself by idle gossips in the amatory rumour of the day. Such had been the case with Sarah, and she dropped her eyes on the carpet with a smile that, aided by the blush which suffused her cheek, in no degree detracted from her native charms. Captain Wharton, without heeding this display of interest in his sister, immediately continued, "At times he is melancholy. We tell him it must be love." Sarah raised her eyes to the face of her brother, and was consciously turning them on the rest of the party, when she met those of her sister laughing with good humour and high spirits, as she cried, "Poor man! Does he despair?" "Why, no. One would think he could not. The eldest son of a man of wealth, so handsome, and a colonel." "Strong reasons, indeed, why he should prevail," said Sarah, endeavouring to laugh, "more particularly the latter." "Let me tell you," replied the captain gravely, "a lieutenant colonelcy in the Guards is a very pretty thing." "And Colonel Wellmere a very pretty man," added Frances. "Nay, Frances," returned her sister, "Colonel Wellmere was never a favourite of yours. He is too loyal to his king to be agreeable to your taste." Frances quickly answered, "And is not Henry loyal to his king?" "Come, come," said Miss Peyton, "no difference of opinion about the colonel. He is a favourite of mine." "Fanny likes majors better," cried the brother, pulling her upon his knee. "Nonsense!" said the blushing girl, as she endeavoured to extricate herself from the grasp of her laughing brother. "It surprises me," continued the captain, that Peyton, when he procured the release of my father, did not endeavour to detain my sister in the rebel camp." "That might have endangered his own liberty," said the smiling girl, resuming her seat. "You know it is liberty for which Major Dunwoodie is fighting." "Liberty!" exclaimed Sarah. "Very pretty liberty, which exchanges one master for 50. "The privilege of changing masters at all is a liberty." "And one you ladies would sometimes be glad to exercise," cried the captain. "We like, I believe, to have the liberty of choosing who they shall be in the first place," said the laughing girl. "Don't we, Aunt Jeanette?" "Me?" cried Miss Peyton, starting. "What do I know of such things, child? You must ask some one else, if you wish to learn such matters." "Ah, you would have us think you were never young. But what am I to believe of all the tales I have heard about the handsome Miss Jeanette Peyton?" "Nonsense, my dear, nonsense," said the aunt, endeavouring to suppress a smile. "It is very silly to believe all you hear." "Nonsense, do you call it?" cried the captain gaily. "To this hour General Montrose toasts Miss Peyton. I heard him within the week, at Sir Henry's table." "Why, Henry, you are as saucy as your sister, and to break in upon your folly I must take you to see my new home-made manufactures, which I will be bold enough to put in contrast with the finery of Birch." The young people rose to follow their aunt, in perfect good humour with each other and the world. On ascending the stairs to the place of deposit for Miss Peyton's articles of domestic economy, she availed herself, however, of an opportunity to inquire of her nephew whether General Montrose suffered as much from the gout as he had done when she knew him. It is a painful discovery we make, as we advance in life, that even those we most love are not exempt from its frailties. When the heart is fresh, and the view of the future unsullied by the blemishes which have been gathered from the experience of the past, our feelings are most holy. We love to identify with the persons of our natural friends all those qualities to which we ourselves aspire, and all those virtues we have been taught to revere. The confidence with which we esteem seems a part of our nature, and there is a purity thrown around the affections which tie us to our kindred, that after life can seldom hope to see uninjured. The family of Mr. Wharton continued to enjoy, for the remainder of the day, a happiness to which they had long been strangers, and one that sprang in its younger members from the delights of the most confident affection, and the exchange of the most disinterested endearments. Harper appeared only at the dinner-table, and he retired with the cloth, under the pretence of some engagement in his own room. Notwithstanding the confidence created by his manner, the family felt his absence a relief, for the visit of Captain Wharton was necessarily to be confined to a very few days, both from the limitation of his leave of absence, and the danger of a discovery. All dread of consequences, however, was lost in the pleasure of the meeting. Once or twice during the day, Mr. Wharton had suggested a doubt as to the character of his unknown guest, and the possibility of the detection of his son proceeding in some manner from his information; but the idea was earnestly opposed by all his children, even Sarah uniting with her brother and sister, in pleading warmly in favour of the sincerity expressed in the outward appearance of the traveller. "Such appearances, my children," replied the desponding parent, "are but too often deceitful. When men like Major André lend themselves to the purposes of fraud, it is idle to reason from qualities, much less externals." "Fraud!" cried his son quickly. "Surely, sir, you forget that Major André was serving his king, and that the usages of war justified the measure." "And did not the usages of war justify his death, Henry?" inquired Frances, speaking in a low voice, unwilling to abandon what she thought the cause of her country, and yet unable to suppress her feelings for the man. "Never!" exclaimed the young man, springing from his seat, and pacing the floor rapidly. Francis, you shock me. Suppose it should be my fate, even now, to fall into the power of the rebels, you would vindicate my execution, perhaps exult in the cruelty of Washington." "Henry," said Francis, solemnly, quivering with emotion, and with a face pale as death, "you little know my heart." "Pardon me, my sister, my little Fanny," cried the repentant youth, pressing her to his bosom, and kissing off the tears which had burst, in spite of her resolution, from her eyes. "It is very foolish to regard your hasty words, I know," said Frances, extricating herself from his arms, and raising her yet humid eyes to his face with a smile. "But reproach from those we love is most severe, Henry, particularly where we think, we know—" Her paleness gradually gave place to the color of the rose, as she concluded in a low voice, with her eyes directed to the carpet, "we are undeserving of it." Miss Peyton moved from her own seat to the one next her niece, and, kindly taking her hand, observed, "You should not suffer the impetuosity of your brother to affect you so much. Boys, you know, are proverbially ungovernable." "And from my conduct you might add cruel," said the captain, seating himself on the other side of his sister. "But on the subject of the death of André, we are all of us uncommonly sensitive. You did not know him. He was all that was brave, that was accomplished, that was estimable." Frances smiled faintly, and shook her head, but made no reply. Her brother, observing the marks of incredulity in her countenance, continued, "You doubt it, and justify his death?" "I do not doubt his worth," replied the maid, mildly, "nor his being deserving of a more happy fate; but I cannot doubt the propriety of Washington's conduct. I know but little of the customs of war, and wish to know less; but with what hopes of success could the Americans contend, if they yielded all the principles which long usage had established to the exclusive purposes of the British?" "Why contend at all?" cried Sarah, impatiently. "Besides, being rebels, all their acts are illegal." "Women are but mirrors, which reflect the images before them," cried the captain, good-naturedly. "In Frances I see the picture of Major Dunwoodie, and in Sarah—" "Colonel Wellmere," interrupted the younger sister, laughing and blushing crimson. "I must confess I am indebted to the major for my reasoning, am I not, Aunt Jeanette?" "I believe it is something like his logic, indeed, child." "I plead guilty. And you, Sarah, have not forgotten the learned discussions of Colonel Wellmere." "I trust I never forget the right," said Sarah, emulating her sister in color, and rising, under the pretence of avoiding the heat of the fire. Nothing occurred of any moment during the rest of the day; but in the evening Caesar reported that he had overheard voices in the room of Harper, conversing in a low tone. The apartment occupied by the traveler was the wing at the extremity of the building, opposite to the parlor in which the family ordinarily assembled, and it seems that Caesar had established a regular system of espionage, with a view to the safety of his young master. This intelligence gave some uneasiness to all the members of the family; but the entrance of Harper himself, with the air of benevolence and sincerity which shone through his reserve, soon removed the doubts from the breast of all but Mr. Wharton. His children and sister believed Caesar to have been mistaken, and the evening passed off without any additional alarm. On the afternoon of the succeeding day, the party were assembled in the parlor around the tea-table of Miss Peyton, when a change in the weather occurred. The thin scud that apparently floated but a short distance above the tops of the hills began to drive from the west towards the east in astonishing rapidity. The rain yet continued to beat against the eastern windows of the house with fury; in that direction the heavens were dark and gloomy. Frances was gazing at the scene with the desire of youth to escape from the tedium of confinement, when, as if by magic, all was still. The rushing winds had ceased, the pelting of the storm was over, and springing to the window, with delight pictured in her face, she saw a glorious ray of sunshine lighting the opposite wood. The foliage glittered with the checkered beauties of the October leaf, reflecting back from the moistened boughs the richest lustre of an American autumn. In an instant the piazza, which opened to the south, was thronged with the inmates of the cottage. The air was mild, balmy, and refreshing. In the east, clouds, which might be likened to the retreating masses of a discomfited army, hung around the horizon in awful and increasing darkness. At a little elevation above the cottage, the thin vapour was still rushing towards the east with amazing velocity, while in the west the sun had broken forth and shed his parting radiance on the scene below, aided by the fullest richness of a clear atmosphere and a freshened herbage. Such moments belong only to the climate of America, and are enjoyed in a degree proportioned to the suddenness of the contrast, and the pleasure we experience in escaping from the turbulence of the elements to the quiet of a peaceful evening, and an air still as the softest mornings in June. "What a magnificent scene!" said Harper in a low tone. "How grand! How awfully sublime! May such a quiet speedily await the struggle in which my country is engaged, and such a glorious evening follow the day of her adversity!" Frances, who stood next to him, alone heard the voice. Turning in amazement from the view to the speaker, she saw him standing bareheaded, erect, and with his eyes lifted to heaven. There was no longer the quiet which had seemed their characteristic, but they were lighted into something like enthusiasm, and a slight flush passed over his features. "There can be no danger apprehended from such a man," thought Frances. "Such feelings belong only to the virtuous." The musings of the party were now interrupted by the sudden appearance of the peddler. He had taken advantage of the first gleam of sunshine to hasten to the cottage. Heedless of wet or dry as it lay in his path, with arms swinging to and fro, and with his head bent forward of his body several inches, Harvey Birch approached the piazza, with a gait peculiarly his own. It was the quick, lengthened pace of an itinerant vendor of goods. "Fine evening," said the peddler, saluting the party without raising his eyes. "Quite warm and agreeable for the season." Mr. Wharton assented to the remark, and inquired kindly after the health of his father. Harvey heard him, and continued standing for some time in moody silence, but the question being repeated, he answered with a slight tremor in his voice, "He fails fast. Old age and hardships will do their work." The peddler turned his face from the view of most of the family, but Frances noticed his glistening eyes and quivering lip, and for the second time Harvey rose in her estimation. The valley in which the residence of Mr. Wharton stood ran in a direction from northwest to southeast, and the house was placed on the side of a hill which terminated its length in the former direction. A small opening, occasioned by the receding of the opposite hill, and the fall of the land to the level of the tide water, afforded a view of the Sound. An island more than 40 leagues in length lies opposite the coasts of New York and Connecticut. The arm of the sea which separates it from the main is technically called a sound, and in that part of the country, par excellence, the Sound. This sheet of water varies in its breadth from 5 to 30 miles. Over the tops of the distant woods on its margin. The surface of the water, which had so lately been lashing the shores with boisterous fury, was already losing its ruffled darkness in the long and regular undulations that succeeded a tempest, while the light air from the southwest was gently touching their summits, lending its feeble aid in stilling the waters. Some dark spots were now to be distinguished, occasionally rising into view, and again sinking behind the lengthened waves which interposed themselves to the sight. They were unnoticed by all but the peddler. He had seated himself on the piazza, at a distance from Harper, and appeared to have forgotten the object of his visit. His roving eye, however, soon caught a glimpse of these new objects in the view, and he sprang up with alacrity, gazing intently towards the water. He changed his place, glanced his eye with marked uneasiness on Harper, and then said with great emphasis, "The wrigglers must be out from below." "Why do you think so?" inquired Captain Wharton, eagerly. "God send it may be true. I want their escort in again." "Them 10 whale-boats would not move so fast, unless they were better manned than common." "Perhaps," cried Mr. Wharton, in alarm, they are Continentals returning from the island." "They look like wrigglers," said the peddler with meaning. "Look!" repeated the captain. "There is nothing but spots to be seen." Harvey disregarded his observation, but seemed to be soliloquizing, as he said in an undertone, "They came out before the gale. Have laid on the island these 2 days. Horse are on the road. There will soon be fighting near us." During this speech, Birch several times glanced his eye towards Harper, with evident uneasiness, but no corresponding emotion betrayed any interest of that gentleman in the scene. He stood in silent contemplation of the view, and seemed enjoying the change in the air. As Birch concluded, however, Harper turned to his host, and mentioned that his business would not admit of unnecessary delay. He would, therefore, avail himself of the fine evening to ride a few miles on his journey. Mr. Wharton made many professions of regret at losing so agreeable an inmate, but was too mindful of his duty not to speed the parting guest, and orders were instantly given to that effect. The uneasiness of the peddler increased in a manner for which nothing apparent could account. His eye was constantly wandering towards the lower end of the vale, as if in expectation of some interruption from that quarter. At length Caesar appeared, leading the noble beast which was to bear the weight of the traveller. The peddler officiously assisted to tighten the girths, and fasten the blue cloak and valise to the mail-straps. Every precaution being completed, Harper proceeded to take his leave. To Sarah and her aunt he paid his compliments with ease and kindness, but when he came to Frances he paused a moment, while his face assumed an expression of more than ordinary benignity. His eye repeated the blessing which had before fallen from his lips, and the girl felt her cheeks glow, and her heart beat with a quicker pulsation as he spoke his adieus. There was a mutual exchange of polite courtesy between the host and his parting guest, but as Harper frankly offered his hand to Captain Wharton, he remarked, in a manner of great solemnity, "The step you have undertaken is one of much danger, and disagreeable consequences to yourself may result from it. In such a case, I may have it in my power to prove the gratitude I owe your family for its kindness." "Surely, sir," cried the father, losing sight of delicacy in apprehension for his child, "you will keep secret the discovery which your being in my house has enabled you to make." Harper turned quickly to the speaker, and then, losing the sternness which had begun to gather on his countenance, he answered mildly, "I have learned nothing in your family, sir, of which I was ignorant before, but your son is safer from my knowledge of his visit than he would be without it." He bowed to the whole party, and without taking any notice of the peddler, other than by simply thanking him for his attentions, mounted his horse, and riding steadily and gracefully through the little gate, was soon lost behind the hill which sheltered the valley to the northward. The eyes of the peddler followed the retiring figure of the horseman so long as it continued within view, and as it disappeared from his sight, he drew a long and heavy sigh, as if relieved from a load of apprehension. The Whartons had meditated in silence on the character and visit of their unknown guest for the same period, when the father approached Birch, and observed, "I am yet your debtor, Harvey, for the tobacco you were so kind as to bring me from the city." "If it should not prove so good as the first," replied the peddler, fixing a last and lingering look in the direction of Harper's route, "it is owing to the scarcity of the article." "I like it much," continued the other, "but you have forgotten to name the price." The countenance of the trader changed, and losing its expression of deep care in a natural acuteness, he answered, "It is hard to say what ought to be the price. I believe I must leave it to your own generosity." Mr. Wharton had taken a hand well filled with the images of Carolus III from his pocket, and now extended it towards Birch, with 3 of the pieces between his finger and thumb. Harvey's eyes twinkled as he contemplated the reward, and rolling over in his mouth a large quantity of the article in question, coolly stretched forth his hand, into which the dollars fell with a most agreeable sound. But not satisfied with the transient music of their fall, the peddler gave each piece in succession a ring on the stepping-stone of the piazza, before he consigned it to the safe keeping of a huge deerskin purse, which vanished from the sight of the spectators so dexterously, that not one of them could have told about what part of his person it was secreted. This very material point in his business so satisfactorily completed, the peddler rose from his seat on the floor of the piazza, and approached to where Captain Wharton stood, supporting his sisters on either arm, as they listened with the lively interest of affection to his conversation. The agitation of the preceding incidents had caused such an expenditure of the juices which had become necessary to the mouth of the peddler, that a new supply of the weed was required before he could turn his attention to business of lesser moment. This done, he asked abruptly, "Captain Wharton, do you go in to-night?" "No," said the captain, laconically, and looking at his lovely burdens with great affection. "Mr. Birch, would you have me leave such company so soon, when I may never enjoy it again?" "Brother," said Frances, "jesting on such a subject is cruel." "I rather guess," continued the peddler, coolly, "now the storm is over, the Skinners may be moving. You had better shorten your visit, Captain Wharton." "Oh," cried the British officer, "a few guineas will buy off those rascals at any time, should I meet them. No, no, Mr. Birch, here I stay until morning." "Money could not liberate Major André," said the peddler dryly. Both the sisters now turned to the captain in alarm, and the elder observed, "You had better take the advice of Harvey. Rest assured, his opinion in such matters ought not to be disregarded." "Yes," added the younger, "if, as I suspect, Mr. Birch assisted you to come here, your safety, our happiness, dear Henry, requires you to listen to him now." "I brought myself out, and can take myself in," said the captain positively. "Our bargain went no further than to procure my disguise, and to let me know when the coast was clear; and in the latter particular you were mistaken, Mr. Birch." "I was," said the peddler, with some interest, "and the greater is the reason why you should get back to-night. The pass I gave you will serve but once." "Cannot you forge another?" The pale cheek of the trader showed an unusual color, but he continued silent, with his eyes fixed on the ground, until the young man added with great positiveness, "Here I stay this night, come what will." "Captain Wharton," said the peddler, with great deliberation and marked emphasis, "beware a tall Virginian, with huge whiskers. He is below you, to my knowledge. The devil can't deceive him. I never could but once." "Let him beware of me," said Wharton, haughtily. "But, Mr. Birch, I exonerate you from further responsibility." "Will you give me that in writing?" asked the cautious Birch. "Oh, cheerfully," cried the captain, with a laugh. "Caesar, pen, ink, and paper, while I write a discharge for my trusty attendant, Harvey Birch, peddler, etc., etc. The implements for writing were produced, and the captain, with great gaiety, wrote the desired acknowledgment in language of his own, which the peddler took, and carefully depositing it by the side of the image of his Catholic Majesty, made a sweeping bow to the whole family, and departed as he had approached. He was soon seen at a distance, stealing into the door of his own humble dwelling. The father and sisters of the captain were too much rejoiced in retaining the young man to express or even entertain the apprehensions his situation might reasonably excite; but on retiring to their evening repast, a cooler reflection induced the captain to think of changing his mind. Unwilling to trust himself out of the protection of his father's domains, the young man dispatched Caesar to desire another interview with Harvey. The black soon returned with the unwelcome intelligence that it was now too late. Katy had told him that Harvey must be miles on his road to the northward, having left home at early candlelight with his pack. Nothing now remained to the captain but patience, until the morning should afford further opportunity of deciding on the best course for him to pursue. "This Harvey Birch, with his knowing looks and portentous warnings, gives me more uneasiness than I am willing to own," said Captain Wharton, rousing himself from a fit of musing in which the danger of his situation made no small part of his meditations. "How is it that he is able to travel to and fro in these difficult times without molestation?" inquired Miss Peyton. "Why the rebels suffer him to escape so easily is more than I can answer," returned the other; "but Sir Henry would not permit a hair of his head to be injured." "Indeed!" cried Frances, with interest. "Is he then known to Sir Henry Clinton?" "At least he ought to be." "Do you think, my son," asked Mr. Wharton, "there is no danger of his betraying you?" "Why, no. I reflected on that before I trusted myself to his power," said the captain, thoughtfully. "He seems to be faithful in matters of business. The danger to himself, should he return to the city, would prevent such an act of villainy." "I think," said Frances, adopting the manner of her brother, "Harvey Birch is not without good feelings. At least, he has the appearance of them at times." "Oh!" cried his sister, exulting, "he has loyalty, and that with me is a cardinal virtue." "I am afraid," said her brother, laughing, "love of money is a stronger passion than love of his king." "Then," said the father, "you cannot be safe while in his power, for no love will withstand the temptations of money, when offered to avarice." "Surely, sir," cried the youth, recovering his gaiety, "there must be one love that can resist anything. Is there not, Fanny? Here is your candle. You keep your father up beyond his usual hour." End of Chapter 4. Recorded on November 6th, 2005, in Oceanside, California.
LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maureen O'Brien. mariaelectrics.blogspot.com. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 5. Through Solway sands, through Taras moss, blindfold he knew the paths to cross. By wily turns, by desperate bounds, had baffled Percy's best bloodhounds. In Esk or Liddell fords were none, but he would ride them one by one. Alike to him was time or tide, December snow or July's pride. Alike to him was tide or time, moonless midnight or matin prime. Walter Scott. All the members of the Wharton family laid their heads on their pillows that night, with a foreboding of some interruption to their ordinary quiet. Uneasiness kept the sisters from enjoying their usual repose, and they rose from their beds on the following morning unrefreshed, and almost without having closed their eyes. On taking an eager and hasty survey of the valley from the windows of their room, nothing, however, but its usual serenity was to be seen. It was glittering with the opening brilliancy of one of those lovely mild days which occur about the time of the falling of the leaf, and which, by their frequency, class the American autumn with the most delightful seasons of other countries. We have no spring. Vegetation seems to leap into existence, instead of creeping, as in the same latitudes of the Old World. But how gracefully it retires! September, October, even November and December, compose the season for enjoyment in the open air. They have their storms, but they are distinct, and not of long continuance, leaving a clear atmosphere and a cloudless sky. As nothing could be seen likely to interrupt the enjoyments and harmony of such a day, the sisters descended to the parlor with a returning confidence in their brother's security and their own happiness. The family were early in assembling around the breakfast table, and Miss Peyton, with a little of that minute precision which creeps into the habits of single life, had pleasantly insisted that the absence of her nephew should in no manner interfere with the regular hours she had established. Consequently, the party were already seated when the captain made his appearance, though the untasted coffee sufficiently proved that by none of his relatives was his absence disregarded. "I think I did much better," he cried, taking a chair between his sisters, and receiving their offered salutes, "to secure a good bed and such a plentiful breakfast, instead of trusting to the hospitality of that renowned corps, the Cowboys." "If you could sleep," said Sarah, "you were more fortunate than Frances and myself. Every murmur of the night air sounded to me like the approach of the rebel army." "Why," said the captain, laughing, "I do acknowledge a little inquietude myself. But how was it with you?" turning to his younger and evidently favorite sister, and tapping her cheek. "Did you see banners in the clouds, and mistake Miss Peyton's Aeolian harp for rebellious music?" "Nay, Henry," rejoined the maid, looking at him affectionately, "much as I love my own country, the approach of her troops just now would give me great pain." The brother made no reply, but returning the fondness expressed in her eye by a look of fraternal tenderness, he gently pressed her hand in silence, when Caesar, who had participated largely in the anxiety of the family, and who had risen with the dawn and kept a vigilant watch on the surrounding objects, as he stood gazing from one of the windows, exclaimed with a face that approached to something like the hues of a white man, "Run, Massa Harry, run! If he love old Caesar, run! Here comes a rebel horse!" "Run!" repeated the British officer, gathering himself up in military pride. "No, Mr. Caesar, running is not my trade." While speaking, he walked deliberately to the window, where the family were already collected in the greatest consternation. At the distance of more than a mile, about 50 dragoons were to be seen, winding down one of the lateral entrances of the valley. In advance, with an officer, was a man attired in the dress of a countryman, who pointed in the direction of the cottage. A small party now left the main body, and moved rapidly towards the object of their destination. On reaching the road which led through the bottom of the valley, they turned their horses' heads to the north. The Whartons continued chained in breathless silence to the spot, watching their movements, when the party, having reached the dwelling of Birch, made a rapid circle around his grounds, and in an instant his house was surrounded by a dozen sentinels. 2 or 3 of the dragoons now dismounted and disappeared. In a few minutes, however, they returned to the yard, followed by Katy, from whose violent gesticulations it was evident that matters of no trifling concern were on the carpet. A short communication with the loquacious housekeeper followed the arrival of the main body of the troop, and the advanced party remounting, the whole moved towards the Locusts with great speed. As yet, None of the family had sufficient presence of mind to devise any means of security for Captain Wharton, but the danger now became too pressing to admit of longer delay, and various means of secreting him were hastily proposed. But they were all haughtily rejected by the young man as unworthy of his character. It was too late to retreat to the woods in the rear of the cottage, for he would unavoidably be seen, and, followed by a troop of horse, as inevitably taken. At length his sisters, with trembling hands, replaced his original disguise, the instruments of which had been carefully kept at hand by Caesar in expectation of some sudden emergency. This arrangement was hastily and imperfectly completed as the dragoons entered the lawn and orchard of the Locusts, riding with the rapidity of the wind, and in their turn the Whartons were surrounded. Nothing remained now but to meet the impending examination with as much indifference as the family could assume. The leader of the horse dismounted, and, followed by a couple of his men, he approached the outer door of the building, which was slowly and reluctantly opened for his admission by Caesar. The heavy tread of the trooper, as he followed the black to the door of the parlor, rang in the ears of the females as it approached nearer and nearer, and drove the blood from their faces to their hearts with a chill that nearly annihilated feeling. A man whose colossal stature manifested the possession of vast strength entered the room, and, removing his cap, he saluted the family with a mildness his appearance did not indicate as belonging to his nature. His dark hair hung around his brow in profusion, though stained with powder which was worn at that day, and his face was nearly hid in the whiskers by which it was disfigured. Still, the expression of his eye, though piercing, was not bad, and his voice, though deep and powerful, was far from unpleasant. Frances ventured to throw a timid glance at his figure as he entered, and saw at once the man from whose scrutiny Harvey Birch had warned them there was so much to be apprehended. "You have no cause for alarm, ladies," said the officer, pausing a moment, and contemplating the pale faces around him. "My business will be confined to a few questions, which, if freely answered, will instantly remove us from your dwelling." "And what may they be, sir?" stammered Mr. Wharton, rising from his chair and waiting anxiously for the reply. "Has there been a strange gentleman staying with you during the storm?" continued the dragoon, speaking with interest, and in some degree sharing in the evident anxiety of the father. "This gentleman here favored us with his company during the rain, and has not yet departed." "This gentleman?" repeated the other, turning to Captain Wharton, and contemplating his figure for a moment, till the anxiety of his countenance gave place to a lurking smile. He approached the youth with an air of comic gravity, and with a low bow continued, "I am sorry for the severe cold you have in your head, sir." "I!" exclaimed the captain in surprise. "I have no cold in my head." "I fancied it, then, from seeing you had covered such handsome black locks with that ugly old wig. It was my mistake. You will please to pardon it." Mr. Wharton groaned aloud, but the ladies, ignorant of the extent of their visitor's knowledge, remained in trembling yet rigid silence. The captain himself moved his hand involuntarily to his head, and discovered that the trepidation of his sisters had left some of his natural hair exposed. The dragoon watched the movement with a continued smile, when, seeming to recollect himself, turning to the father, he proceeded, "Then, sir, I am to understand there has not been a Mr. Harper here within the week?" "Mr. Harper?" echoed the other, feeling a load removed from his heart. "Yes, I had forgotten. But he is gone, and if there be anything wrong in his character, we are in entire ignorance of it. To me he was a total stranger." "You have but little to apprehend from his character," answered the dragoon, dryly. "But he is gone. How, when, and whither?" "He departed as he arrived," said Mr. Wharton, gathering renewed confidence from the manner of the trooper, "on horseback, last evening, and he took the northern road." The officer listened to him with intense interest, his countenance gradually lighting into a smile of pleasure; and the instant Mr. Wharton concluded his laconic reply, he turned on his heel and left the apartment. The Whartons, judging from his manner, thought he was about to proceed in quest of the object of his inquiries. They observed the dragoon, on gaining the lawn, in earnest and apparently pleased conversation with his two subalterns. In a few moments orders were given to some of the troops, and horsemen left the valley at full speed, by its various roads. The suspense of the party within, who were all highly interested witnesses of this scene, was shortly terminated, for the heavy tread of the dragoon soon announced his second approach. He bowed again politely as he re-entered the room, and walking up to Captain Wharton, said, with comic gravity, "Now, sir, my principal business being done, may I beg to examine the quality of that wig?" The British officer imitated the manner of the other, as he deliberately uncovered his head, and handing him the wig, observed, "I hope, sir, that it is to your liking." "I cannot, without violating the truth, say it is," returned the dragoon. "I prefer your ebony hair, from which you seem to have combed the powder with great industry. But that must have been a sad hurt you have received under this enormous black patch." "You appear so close an observer of things, I should like your opinion of it, sir," said Henry, removing the silk and exhibiting the cheek free from blemish. "Upon my word, you improve most rapidly in externals," added the trooper, preserving his muscles in inflexible gravity. "If I could but persuade you to exchange this old surtout for that handsome blue coat by your side, I think I never could witness a more agreeable metamorphosis since I was changed myself from a lieutenant to a captain." Young Wharton very composedly did as was required, and stood an extremely handsome, well-dressed young man. The dragoon looked at him for a minute with the drollery that characterized his manner, and then continued, "This is a newcomer to the scene. It is usual, you know, for strangers to be introduced. I am Captain Lawton, of the Virginia Horse." "And I, sir, am Captain Wharton, of His Majesty's 60th Regiment of Foot," returned Henry, bowing stiffly, and recovering his natural manner. The countenance of Lawton changed instantly, and his assumed quaintness vanished. He viewed the figure of Captain Wharton as he stood proudly swelling with a pride that disdained further concealment, and exclaimed with great earnestness, "Captain Wharton, from my soul I pity you." "Oh, then," cried the father in agony, "if you pity him, dear sir, why molest him? He is not a spy. Nothing but a desire to see his friends prompted him to venture so far from the regular army in disguise. Leave him with us. There is no reward, no sum which I will not cheerfully pay." "Sir, your anxiety for your friend excuses your language," said Lawton haughtily, "but you forget I am a Virginian and a gentleman." Turning to the young man, he continued, "Were you ignorant, Captain Wharton, that our pickets have been below you for several days?" "I did not know it until I reached them, and it was then too late to retreat," said Wharton solemnly. "I came out, as my father has mentioned, to see my friends, understanding your parties to be at Peekskill and near the Highlands, or surely I would not have ventured." "All this may be very true, but the affair of Andre has made us on the alert. When treason reaches the grade of general officers, Captain Wharton, it behooves the friends of liberty to be vigilant." Henry bowed to this remark in distant silence, but Sarah ventured to urge something in behalf of her brother. The dragoon heard her politely, and apparently with commiseration, but willing to avoid useless and embarrassing petitions, he answered mildly, "I am not the commander of the party, madam. Major Dunwoodie will decide what must be done with your brother. At all events, he will receive nothing but kind and gentle treatment." "Dunwoodie!" exclaimed Frances, with a face in which the roses contended for the mastery with the paleness of apprehension. "Thank God! Then Henry is safe." Lawton regarded her with a mingled expression of pity and admiration. Then, shaking his head doubtingly, he continued, "I hope so, and with your permission we will leave the matter for his decision." The color of Frances changed from the paleness of fear to the glow of hope. Her dread on behalf of her brother was certainly greatly diminished, yet her form shook, her breathing became short and irregular, and her whole frame gave tokens of extraordinary agitation. Her eyes rose from the floor to the dragoon, and were again fixed immovably on the carpet. She evidently wished to utter something, but was unequal to the effort. Miss Peyton was a close observer of these movements of her niece, and advancing with an air of feminine dignity, inquired, "Then, sir, we may expect the pleasure of Major Dunwoodie's company shortly?" "Immediately, madam," answered the dragoon, withdrawing his admiring gaze from the person of Frances. "Expresses are already on the road to announce to him our situation, and the intelligence will speedily bring him to this valley, unless, indeed, some private reasons may exist to make a visit particularly unpleasant. We shall always be happy to see Major Dunwoodie." "Oh, doubtless, he is a general favorite. May I presume on it so far as to ask leave to dismount and refresh my men, who compose a part of his squadron?" There was a manner about the trooper that would have made the omission of such a request easily forgiven by Mr. Wharton, but he was fairly entrapped by his own eagerness to conciliate, and it was useless to withhold a consent which he thought would probably be extorted. He therefore made the most of necessity, and gave such orders as would facilitate the wishes of Captain Lawton. The officers were invited to take their morning's repast at the family breakfast table, and having made their arrangements without, the invitation was frankly accepted. None of the watchfulness which was so necessary to their situation was neglected by the wary partisan. Patrols were seen on the distant hills, taking their protecting circuit around their comrades, who were enjoying, in the midst of danger, a security that can only spring from the watchfulness of discipline and the indifference of habit. The addition to the party at Mr. Wharton's table was only 3, and they were all of them men who, under the rough exterior induced by actual and arduous service, concealed the manners of gentlemen. Consequently, the interruption to the domestic privacy of the family was marked by the observance of strict decorum. The ladies left the table to their guests, who proceeded, without much superfluous diffidence, to do proper honors to the hospitality of Mr. Wharton. At length, Captain Lawton suspended for a moment his violent attacks on the buckwheat cakes, to inquire of the master of the house if there was not a peddler of the name of Birch, who lived in the valley at times. "At times only, I believe, sir," replied Mr. Wharton cautiously. "He is seldom here. I may say I never see him." "That is strange, too," said the trooper, looking at the disconcerted host intently. "Considering he is your next neighbor, he must be quite domestic, sir, and to the ladies it must be somewhat inconvenient. I doubt not that that muslin in the window-seat cost twice as much as he would have asked them for it." Mr. Wharton turned in consternation, and saw some of the recent purchases scattered about the room. The 2 subalterns struggled to conceal their smiles, but the captain resumed his breakfast with an eagerness that created a doubt whether he ever expected to enjoy another. The necessity of a supply from the dominion of Dinah soon, however, afforded another respite, of which Lawton availed himself. "I had a wish to break this Mr. Birch of his unsocial habits, and gave him a call this morning," he said. "Had I found him within, I should have placed him where he would enjoy life in the midst of society, for a short time at least." "And where might that be, sir?" asked Mr. Wharton, conceiving it necessary to say something. "The guard-room," said the trooper dryly. "What is the offense of poor Birch?" asked Miss Peyton, handing the dragoon a 4th dish of coffee. "Poor!" cried the captain. "If he is poor, King George is a bad paymaster." "Yes, indeed," said one of the subalterns. His Majesty owes him a dukedom, and Congress a halter," continued the commanding officer, commencing anew on a fresh supply of the cakes. "I am sorry," said Mr. Wharton, "that any neighbor of mine should incur the displeasure of our rulers." "If I catch him," cried the dragoon, while buttering another cake, "he will dangle from the limbs of one of his namesakes." "He would make no bad ornament, suspended from one of those locusts before his own door," added the lieutenant. "Never mind," continued the captain, "I will have him yet, before I'm a major." As the language of the officers appeared to be sincere, and such as disappointed men in their rough occupations are but too apt to use, the Whartons thought it prudent to discontinue the subject. It was no new intelligence to any of the family that Harvey Birch was distrusted and greatly harassed by the American army. His escapes from their hands, no less than his imprisonments, had been the conversation of the country in too many instances, and under circumstances of too great mystery, to be easily forgotten. In fact, no small part of the bitterness expressed by Captain Lawton against the peddler arose from the unaccountable disappearance of the latter when entrusted to the custody of two of his most faithful dragoons. A 12-month had not yet elapsed since Birch had been seen lingering near the headquarters of the commander-in-chief, and at a time when important movements were expected hourly to occur. So soon as the information of this fact was communicated to the officer whose duty it was to guard the avenues of the American camp, he dispatched Captain Lawton in pursuit of the peddler. Acquainted with all the passes of the hills, and indefatigable in the discharge of his duty, the trooper had, with much trouble and toil, succeeded in effecting his object. The party had halted at a farmhouse for the purposes of refreshment, and the prisoner was placed in a room by himself, but under the keeping of the two men before mentioned. All that was known subsequently is, that a woman was seen busily engaged in the employments of the household near the sentinels, and was particularly attentive to the wants of the captain, until he was deeply engaged in the employments of the supper table. Afterwards, neither woman nor peddler was to be found. The pack, indeed, was discovered open and nearly empty, and a small door, communicating with a room adjoining to the one in which the peddler had been secured, was ajar. Captain Lawton never could forgive the deception. His antipathies to his enemies were not very moderate, but this was adding an insult to his penetration that rankled deeply. He sat in pretentious silence, brooding over this exploit of his prisoner, yet mechanically pursuing the business before him, until, after sufficient time had passed to make a very comfortable meal, a trumpet suddenly broke on the ears of the party, sending its martial tones up the valley in startling melody. The trooper rose instantly from the table, exclaiming, "Quick, gentlemen, to your horses! There comes Dunwoodie!" and, followed by his officers, he precipitately left the room. With the exception of the sentinels left to guard Captain Wharton, the dragoons mounted, and marched out to meet their comrades. None of the watchfulness necessary in a war, in which similarity of language, appearance, and customs rendered prudence doubly necessary, was omitted by the cautious leader. On getting sufficiently near, however, to a body of horse of more than double his own number, to distinguish countenances, Lawton plunged his rowels into his charger, and in a moment he was by the side of his commander. The ground in front of the cottage was again occupied by the horse, and, observing the same precautions as before, the newly arrived troops hastened to participate in the cheer prepared for their comrades. End of Chapter 5. Read by Maureen O'Brien in Kettering, Ohio, on December 9th and 10th, 2005. LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maureen O'Brien, marieelectrics.blogspot.com. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 6. And let conquerors boast their fields of fame. He who in virtue arms a young warm spirit against beauty's charms, who feels her brightness, yet defies her thrall, is the best, bravest conqueror of them all. Moore. The ladies of the Wharton family had collected about a window, deeply interested in the scene we have related. Sarah viewed the approach of her countrymen with a smile of contemptuous indifference, for she even undervalued the personal appearance of men whom she thought arrayed in the unholy cause of rebellion. Miss Peyton looked on the gallant show with an exulting pride, which arose in the reflection that the warriors before her were the chosen troops of her native colony, while Frances gazed with a singleness of interest that absorbed all other considerations. The two parties had not yet joined before her quick eye distinguished one horseman in particular from those around him. To her it appeared that even the steed of this youthful soldier seemed to be conscious that he sustained the weight of no common man. His hoofs but lightly touched the earth, and his airy tread was the curbed motion of a blooded charger. The dragoon sat in the saddle, with a firmness and ease that showed him the master of himself and horse, his figure uniting the just proportions of strength and activity, being tall, round, and muscular. To this officer Lawton made his report, and side by side they rode into the field opposite to the cottage. The heart of Francis beat with a pulsation nearly stifling as he paused for a moment and took a survey of the building, with an eye whose dark and sparkling glance could be seen, notwithstanding the distance. Her color changed, and for an instant, as she saw the youth throw himself from the saddle, she was compelled to seek relief for her trembling limbs in a chair. The officer gave a few hasty orders to his second-in-command, walked rapidly into the lawn, and approached the cottage. Frances rose from her seat and vanished from the apartment. The dragoon ascended the steps of the piazza, and had barely time to touch the outer door when it opened to his admission. The youth of Frances, when she left the city, had prevented her sacrificing, in conformity to the customs of that day, all her native beauties on the altar of fashion. Her hair, which was of a golden richness of color, was left untortured to fall in the natural ringlets of infancy, and it shaded a face which was glowing with the united charms of health, youth, and artlessness. Her eyes spoke volumes, but her tongue was silent. Her hands were interlocked before her, and, aided by her taper form, bending forward in an attitude of expectation, gave a loveliness and an interest to her appearance that for a moment chained her lover in silence to the spot. Frances silently led the way into a vacant parlor, opposite to the one in which the family were assembled, and turning to the soldier frankly, placing both her hands in his own, exclaimed, "Ah, Dunwoodie, how happy on many accounts I am to see you! I have brought you in here to prepare you to meet an unexpected friend in the opposite room." "To whatever cause it may be owing," cried the youth, pressing her hands to his lips, "I, too, am happy in being able to see you alone. Frances, the probation you have decreed is cruel. War and distance may separate us forever. We must submit to the necessity which governs us. But it is not love speeches I would hear now. I have other and more important matter for your attention." "What can be of more importance than to make you mine by a tie that will be indissoluble? Frances, you are cold to me, from whose mind days of service and nights of alarm have never been able to banish your image for a single moment." "Dear Dunwoodie," said Frances, softening nearly to tears, and again extending her hand to him, as the richness of her color gradually returned, "you know my sentiments. This war once ended, and you may take that hand forever. But I can never consent to tie myself to you by any closer union than already exists, so long as you are arrayed in arms against my only brother. Even now, that brother is awaiting your decision to restore him to liberty, or to conduct him to a probable death." "Your brother!" cried Dunwoodie, starting and turning pale. "Your brother! Explain yourself. What dreadful warning is concealed in your words?" "Has not Captain Lawton told you of the arrest of Henry by himself this very morning?" continued Frances, in a voice barely audible, and fixing on her lover a look of the deepest concern. "He told me of arresting a captain of the 60th in disguise, but without mentioning where or whom," replied the Major in a similar tone; and dropping his head between his hands, he endeavored to conceal his feelings from his companion. "Dunwoodie! Dunwoodie!" exclaimed Frances, losing all her former confidence in the most fearful apprehensions. "What means this agitation?" As the Major slowly raised his face, in which was pictured the most expressive concern, she continued, "Surely, surely you will not betray your friend, my brother, your brother, to an ignominious death?" "Frances!" exclaimed the young man in agony, "what can I do?" "Do?" she repeated, gazing at him wildly. "Would Major Dunwoodie yield his friend to his enemies, the brother of his betrothed wife? Oh, speak not so unkindly to me, dearest Miss Wharton. My own Frances, I would this moment die for you, for Henry; but I cannot forget my duty, cannot forfeit my honor. You yourself would be the first to despise me if I did." "Peyton Dunwoodie," said Frances solemnly, and with a face of ashy paleness, "you have told me, you have sworn that you love me." "I do," interrupted the soldier with fervor; but motioning for silence, she continued, in a voice that trembled with her fears, "Do you think I can throw myself into the arms of a man whose hands are stained with the blood of my only brother?" "Frances, you wring my very heart." Then pausing to struggle with his feelings, he endeavored to force a smile, as he added, "But, after all, we may be torturing ourselves with unnecessary fears, and Henry, when I know the circumstances, may be nothing more than a prisoner of war, in which case I can liberate him on parole." There is no more delusive passion than hope, and it seems to be the happy privilege of youth to call all the pleasures that can be gathered from its indulgence. It is when we are most worthy of confidence ourselves that we are least apt to distrust others, and what we think ought to be, we are prone to think will be. The half-formed expectations of the young soldier were communicated to the desponding sister more by the eye than the voice, and the blood rushed again to her cheek as she cried, "Oh, there can be no just grounds to doubt it! I knew, Dunwoodie, you would never desert us in the hour of our greatest need." The violence of her feelings prevailed, and the agitated girl found relief in a flood of tears. The office of consoling those we love is one of the dearest prerogatives of affection, and Major Dunwoodie, though but little encouraged by his own momentary suggestion of relief, could not undeceive the lovely girl who leaned on his shoulder as he wiped the traces of her feeling from her face, with a trembling but reviving confidence in the safety of her brother and the protection of her lover. Frances, having sufficiently recovered her recollection to command herself, now eagerly led the way to the opposite room, to communicate to her family the pleasing intelligence which she already conceived so certain. Dunwoodie followed her reluctantly, and with forebodings of the result; but a few moments brought him into the presence of his relatives, and he summoned all his resolution to meet the trial with firmness. The salutations of the young men were cordial and frank, and on the part of Henry Wharton, as collected as if nothing had occurred to disturb his self-possession. The abhorrence of being in any manner auxiliary to the arrest of his friend, the danger to the life of Captain Wharton, and the heart-breaking declarations of Frances, had, however, created an uneasiness in the bosom of Major Dunwoodie which all his efforts could not conceal. His reception by the rest of the family was kind and sincere, both from old regard and a remembrance of former obligations, heightened by the anticipations they could not fail to read in the expressive eyes of the blushing girl by his side. After exchanging greetings with every member of the family, Major Dunwoodie beckoned to the sentinel, whom the wary prudence of Captain Lawton had left in charge of the prisoner, to leave the room. Turning to Captain Wharton, he inquired mildly, "Tell me, Henry, the circumstances of this disguise in which Captain Lawton reports you to have been found. And remember, Captain Wharton, your answers are entirely voluntary." "The disguise was used by me, Major Dunwoodie," replied the English officer gravely, "to enable me to visit my friends, without incurring the danger of becoming a prisoner of war." "But you did not wear it until you saw the troop of Lawton approaching?" "Oh, no!" interrupted Frances eagerly, forgetting all the circumstances in her anxiety for her brother. "Sarah and myself placed them on him when the dragoons appeared, and it was our awkwardness that has led to the discovery." The countenance of Dunwoodie brightened, as turning his eyes in fondness on the speaker, he listened to her explanation. "Probably some articles of your own," he continued, "which were at hand, and were used on the spur of the moment." "No," said Wharton with dignity. "The clothes were worn by me from the city. They were procured for the purpose to which they were applied, and I intended to use them in my return this very day." The appalled Frances shrank back from between her brother and lover, where her ardent feelings had carried her, as the whole truth glanced over her mind, and she sank into a seat, gazing wildly on the young men. "But the pickets? The party at the Plains?" added Dunwoodie, turning pale. "I passed them, too, in disguise. I made use of this pass, for which I paid, and as it bears the name of Washington, I presume it is forged." Dunwoodie caught the paper from his hand eagerly, and stood gazing on the signature for some time in silence, during which the soldier gradually prevailed over the man, when he turned to the prisoner with a searching look, as he asked, "Captain Wharton, whence did you procure this paper?" "That is a question, I conceive, Major Dunwoodie has no right to ask." "Your pardon, sir. My feelings may have led me into an impropriety." Mr. Wharton, who had been a deeply interested auditor, now so far conquered his feelings as to say, "Surely, Major Dunwoodie, the paper cannot be material. Such artifices are used daily in war."
"This name is no counterfeit," said the dragoon, studying the characters and speaking in a low voice. "Is treason yet among us undiscovered? The confidence of Washington has been abused, for the fictitious name is in a different hand from the pass. Captain Wharton, my duty will not suffer me to grant you a parole. You must accompany me to the Highlands." "I did not expect otherwise, Major Dunwoodie."
Dunwoodie turned slowly towards the sisters, when the figure of Frances once more arrested his gaze. She had risen from her seat, and stood again with her hands clasped before him in an attitude of petition. Feeling himself unable to contend longer with his feelings, he made a hurried excuse for a temporary absence, and left the room. Frances followed him, and, obedient to the direction of her eye, the soldier re-entered the apartment in which had been their first interview. "Major Dunwoodie," said Frances, in a voice barely audible, as she beckoned to him to be seated. Her cheek, which had been of a chilling whiteness, was flushed with a suffusion that crimsoned her whole countenance. She struggled with herself for a moment, and continued, "I have already acknowledged to you my esteem. Even now, when you most painfully distress me, I wish not to conceal it. Believe me, Henry is innocent of everything but imprudence. Our country can sustain no wrong." Again she paused, and almost gasped for breath. Her color changed rapidly from red to white, until the blood rushed into her face, covering her features with the brightest vermilion, and she added hastily, in an undertone, "I have promised Dunwoodie, when peace shall be restored to our country, to become your wife. Give to my brother his liberty on parole, and I will this day go with you to the altar, follow you to the camp, and in becoming a soldier's bride, learn to endure a soldier's privations." Dunwoodie seized the hand which the blushing girl, in her ardor, had extended toward him, and pressed it for a moment to his bosom. Then, rising from his seat, he paced the room in excessive agitation. "Frances, say no more, I conjure you, unless you wish to break my heart." "You then reject my offered hand?" she said, rising with dignity, though her pale cheek and quivering lip plainly showed the conflicting passions within. "Reject it! Have I not sought it with entreaties, with tears? Has it not been the goal of all my earthly wishes? But to take it under such conditions would be to dishonor both. We will hope for better things. Henry must be acquitted, perhaps not tried. No intercession of mine shall be wanting, you must well know. And believe me, Frances, I am not without favor with Washington." "That very paper, that abuse of his confidence, to which you alluded, will steel him to my brother's case. If threats or entreaties could move his stern sense of justice, would Andre have suffered?" As Frances uttered these words, she fled from the room in despair. Dunwoodie remained for a minute nearly stupefied, and then he followed with a view to vindicate himself and to relieve her apprehensions. On entering the hall that divided the two parlors, he was met by a small ragged boy, who looked one moment at his dress, and placing a piece of paper in his hands, immediately vanished through the outer door of the building. The bewildered state of his mind and the suddenness of the occurrence gave the Major barely time to observe the messenger to be a country lad, meanly attired, and that he held in his hand one of those toys which are to be bought in cities, and which he now apparently contemplated with the conscious pleasure of having fairly purchased by the performance of the service required. The soldier turned his eyes to the subject of the note. It was written on a piece of torn and soiled paper, and in a hand barely legible, but after some little labor he was able to make out as follows: "The Rigglers are at hand, horse and foot." Footnote: There died a few years since, in Bedford, Westchester, a yeoman named Elisha H. This person was employed by Washington as one of his most confidential spies. By the conditions of their bargain, H. was never required to deal with third parties, since his risks were too imminent. He was allowed to enter also into the service of Sir Henry Clinton, and so much confidence had Washington in his love of country and discretion, that he was often entrusted with the minor military movements, in order that he might enhance his value with the English general by communicating them. In this manner H. had continued to serve for a long period, when chance brought him into the city, then held by the British, at a moment when an expedition was about to quit it, to go against a small post established at Bedford, his native village, where the Americans had a depot of provisions. H. easily ascertained the force and destination of the detachment ordered on this service, but he was at a loss in what manner to communicate his information to the officer in command at Bedford, without betraying his own true character to a third person. There was not time to reach Washington, and under the circumstances he finally resolved to hazard a short note to the American commandant, stating the danger and naming the time when the attack might be expected. To this note he even ventured to affix his own initials, E.H., though he had disguised the hand, under a belief that as he knew himself to be suspected by his countrymen, it might serve to give more weight to his warning. His family being at Bedford, the note was transmitted with facility and arrived in good season, H. himself remaining in New York. The American commandant did what every sensible officer in a similar case would have done. He sent a courier with the note to Washington, demanding orders,
while he prepared his little party to make the best defense in his power. The headquarters of the American army were, at that time, in the Highlands. Fortunately, the express met Washington on a tour of observation near their entrance. The note was given to him, and he read it in the saddle, adding in pencil, "Believe all that E.H. tells you. George Washington." He returned it to the courier with an injunction to ride for life or death. The courier reached Bedford after the British had made their attack. The commandant read the reply and put it in his pocket. The Americans were defeated and their leader killed. The note of H, with the line written on it by Washington, was found on his person. The following day H was summoned to the presence of Sir Henry Clinton. After the latter had put several general questions, he suddenly gave the note to the spy and asked if he knew the handwriting, and demanded who the E.H. was. "It is Elijah Haddon, the spy you hanged yesterday at Powell's Hook." The readiness of this answer, connected with the fact that a spy having the same initials had been executed the day before, and the coolness of H, saved him. Sir Henry Clinton allowed him to quit his presence, and he never saw him afterwards. Dunwoodie started, and forgetting everything but the duties of a soldier, he precipitately left the house. While walking rapidly towards the troop, he noticed on a distant hill a vidette riding with speed. Several pistols were fired in quick succession, and the next instant the trumpets of the corps rang in his ears with the enlivening strain of "To arms!" By the time he had reached the ground occupied by his squadron, the major saw that every man was in active motion. Lawton was already in the saddle, eyeing the opposite extremity of the valley with the eagerness of expectation, and crying to the musicians, in tones but little lower than their own, "Sound away, my lads, and let these Englishmen know that the Virginia horse are between them and the end of their journey." The vedettes and patrols now came pouring in, each making in succession his hasty report to the commanding officer, who gave his orders coolly, and with a promptitude that made obedience certain. Once only, as he wheeled his horse to ride over the ground in front, did Dunwoodie trust himself with a look at the cottage, and his heart beat with unusual rapidity as he saw a female figure standing with clasped hands at a window of the room in which he had met Frances. The distance was too great to distinguish her features, but the soldier could not doubt that it was his mistress. The paleness of his cheek and the languor of his eye endured but a moment longer. As he rode towards the intended battle-ground, a flush of ardor began to show itself on his sunburnt features, and his dragoons, who studied the face of their leader as the best index to their own fate, saw again the wonted flashing of the eyes and the cheerful animation which they had so often witnessed on the eve of battle. By the additions of the vedettes and the parties that had been out, and which now had all joined, the whole number of the horse was increased to nearly 200. There was also a small body of men whose ordinary duties were those of guides, but who in cases of emergency were embodied and did duty as foot soldiers. These were dismounted, and proceeded by the order of Dunwoodie to level the few fences which might interfere with the intended movements of the cavalry. The neglect of husbandry which had been occasioned by the war left this task comparatively easy. Those long lines of heavy and durable walls, which now sweep through every part of the country, 40 years ago were unknown. The slight and tottering fences of stone were then used more to clear the land for the purposes of cultivation than as permanent barriers, and required the constant attention of the husbandman to preserve them against the fury of the tempests and the frosts of winter. Some few of them had been built with more care immediately around the dwelling of Mr. Wharton, but those which had intersected the vale below were generally a pile of ruins, over which the horses of the Virginians would bound with the fleetness of the wind. Occasionally a short line yet preserved its erect appearance, but as none of those crossed the ground on which Dunwoodie intended to act, there remained only the slighter fences of rails to be thrown down. Their duty was hastily but effectually performed, and the guides withdrew to the post assigned to them for the approaching fight. Major Dunwoodie had received from his scouts all the intelligence concerning his foe which was necessary to enable him to make his arrangements. The bottom of the valley was an even plain that fell with a slight inclination from the foot of the hills on either side to the level of a natural meadow that wound through the country on the banks of a small stream, by whose water it was often inundated and fertilized. This brook was easily forded in any part of its course, and the only impediment it offered to the movements of the horse was in a place where it changed its bed from the western to the eastern side of the valley, and where its banks were more steep and difficult of access than common. Here the highway crossed it by a rough wooden bridge, as it did again at a distance of half a mile above the Locusts. The hills on the eastern side of the valley were abrupt, and frequently obtruded themselves in rocky prominences into its bosom, lessening the width to half the usual dimensions. One of these projections was but a short distance in the rear of the squadron of dragoons, and Dunwoodie directed Captain Lawton to withdraw with 2 troops behind its cover. The officer obeyed with a kind of surly reluctance, that was, however, somewhat lessened by the anticipations of the effect his sudden appearance would make on the enemy. Dunwoodie knew his man, and had selected the captain for this service, both because he feared his precipitation in the field, and knew when needed his support would never fail to appear. It was only in front of the enemy that Captain Lawton was hasty. At all other times his discernment and self-possession were consummately preserved, but he sometimes forgot them in his eagerness to engage. On the left of the ground on which Dunwoodie intended to meet his foe was a close wood, which skirted that side of the valley for the distance of a mile. Into this, then, the guides retired, and took their station near its edge, in such a manner as would enable them to maintain a scattering but effectual fire on the advancing column of the enemy. It cannot be supposed that all these preparations were made unheeded by the inmates of the cottage. On the contrary, every feeling which can agitate the human breast in witnessing such a scene was actively alive. Mr. Wharton alone saw no hopes to himself in the termination of the conflict. If the British should prevail, his son would be liberated, but what would then be his own fate? He had hitherto preserved his neutral character in the midst of trying circumstances. The fact of his having a son in the royal, or, as it was called, the regular army, had very nearly brought his estates to the hammer. Nothing had obviated this result but the powerful interest of the relation who held a high political rank in the state, and his own vigilant prudence. In his heart he was a devoted loyalist, and when the blushing Frances had communicated to him the wishes of her lover on their return from the American camp the preceding spring, the consent he had given to her future union with a rebel was as much extracted by the increasing necessity which existed for his obtaining Republican support as by any considerations for the happiness of his child. Should his son now be rescued, he would, in the public mind, be united with him as a plotter against the freedom of the States; and should he remain a captive and undergo the impending trial, the consequences might be still more dreadful. Much as he loved his wealth, Mr. Wharton loved his children better, and as he sat gazing on the movements without, with a listless vacancy in his countenance that fully denoted his imbecility of character, far different were the feelings of the son. Captain Wharton had been left in the keeping of 2 dragoons, one of whom marched to and fro on the piazza with a measured tread, and the other had been directed to continue in the same apartment with his prisoner. The young man had witnessed all the movements of Dunwoodie with admiration mingled with fearful anticipations of the consequences to friends. He particularly disliked the ambush of the detachment under Lawton, who could be distinctly seen from the windows of the cottage, cooling his impatience by pacing on foot the ground in front of his men. Henry Wharton threw several hasty and inquiring glances around, to see if no means of liberation would offer, but invariably found the eyes of his sentinel fixed on him with the watchfulness of an Argus. He longed with the ardor of youth to join in the glorious fray, but was compelled to remain a dissatisfied spectator of a scene in which he would so cheerfully have been an actor. Miss Peyton and Sarah continued gazing on the preparations with varied emotions, in which concern for the fate of the captain formed the more prominent feeling, until the moment of the shedding of blood seemed approaching, when, with the timidity of their sex, they sought the retirement of an inner room. Not so Frances. She returned to the apartment where she had left Dunwoodie, and from one of its windows had been a deeply interested spectator of all his movements. The wheeling of the troops, the deadly preparations, had all been unnoticed. She saw her lover only, and with mingled emotions of admiration and dread that nearly chilled her. At one moment the blood rushed to her heart, as she saw the young warrior riding through his ranks, giving life and courage to all whom he addressed. And the next, it curdled with the thought that the very gallantry she so much valued might prove the means of placing the grave between her and the object of her regard. Frances gazed until she could look no longer. In a field on the left of the cottage, and at a short distance in the rear of the troops, was a small group whose occupation seemed to differ from that of all around them. They were in number only 3, being 2 men and a mulatto boy. The principal personage of this party was a man whose leanness made his really tall stature appear excessive. He wore spectacles, was unarmed, had dismounted, and seemed to be dividing his attention between a cigar, a book, and the incidents of the field before him. To this party Frances determined to send a note, directed to Dunwoodie. She wrote hastily with a pencil, "Come to me, Peyton, if it be but for a moment," and Caesar emerged from the cellar kitchen, taking the precaution to go by the rear of the building to avoid the sentinel on the piazza, who had very cavalierly ordered all the family to remain housed. The black delivered the note to the gentleman, with a request that it might be forwarded to Major Dunwoodie. It was the surgeon of the horse to whom Caesar addressed himself, and the teeth of the African chattered as he saw displayed on the ground the several instruments which were in preparation for the anticipated operations. The doctor himself seemed to view the arrangement with great satisfaction, as he deliberately raised his eyes from his book to order the boy to convey the note to his commanding officer, and then, dropping them quietly on the page, he continued his occupation. Caesar was slowly retiring, as the third personage, who by his dress might be an inferior assistant of the surgical department, coolly inquired if he would have a leg taken off. This question seemed to remind the black of the existence of those limbs, for he made such use of them as to reach the piazza at the same instant that Major Dunwoodie rode up at half speed. The brawny sentinel squared himself, and poised his sword with military precision as he stood on his post, while his officer passed. But no sooner had the door closed than, turning to the negro, he said sharply, "Harkee, harkee, if you quit the house again without my knowledge, I shall turn barber, and shave off one of those ebony ears with this razor." Thus assailed in another court member, Caesar hastily retreated into his kitchen, muttering something in which the words "Skinner" and "rebel rascal" formed a principal part of speech. "Major Dunwoodie," said Frances to her lover as he entered, "I may have done you injustice, if I have appeared harsh." The emotions of the agitated girl prevailed, and she burst into tears. "Frances," cried the soldier with warmth, "you are never harsh, never unjust, but when you doubt my love." "Ah, Dunwoodie," added the sobbing girl, "you are about to risk your life in battle. Remember that there is one heart whose happiness is built on your safety. Brave I know you are. Be prudent." "For your sake?" inquired the delighted youth. "For my sake," replied Frances, in a voice barely audible, and dropping on his bosom. Dunwoodie folded her to his heart, and was about to speak, as a trumpet sounded in the southern end of the vale. Imprinting one long kiss of affection on her unresisting lips, the soldier tore himself from his mistress, and hastened to the scene of strife. Frances threw herself on a sofa, buried her head under its cushion, and with her shawl drawn over her face to exclude as much of sound as possible, continued there until the shouts of the combatants, the rattling of the firearms, and the thundering tread of the horses had ceased. Chapter 7